The night before my husband thought he'd destroyed my life, I stood in our walk-in closet and watched him pack his suitcase with the careful precision of a man who believed he had already won. He didn't know I was standing there. He didn't know a lot of things. My name is Vivienne, and I'm 37 years old. I'm a forensic compliance analyst at a mid-sized financial services firm in Toronto, which means I spend my days finding the things people don't want found. Discrepancies in ledgers, patterns in wire transfers, the small, deliberate mistakes that people make when they're trying to be clever. I'm good at it. Better than good. My husband, Callum, 41, senior partner at a pharmaceutical distribution company headquartered in Mississauga, used to say my job was basically accounting but sadder. He thought that was funny. For a long time, I did too. We'd been married 9 years. We had a house in Oakville, a joint line of credit, a golden retriever named Bishop who slept on the foot of the bed, and what I genuinely believed was a marriage that had simply settled into the comfortable quiet of two people who knew each other very well. I confused familiarity with trust. That was my mistake, the only one I made. The first sign was not dramatic. It never is. It was a Tuesday in late February, and I came home from work 40 minutes early because the DVP was clear for once in its life, and I'd actually made good time from the office downtown. Callum's car was in the driveway, which was unusual. He normally didn't leave Mississauga before 6. I let myself in, hung up my coat, and heard him laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. A loose, unguarded laugh. The kind you make when you're not performing for anyone. He was in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, and when he saw me come around the corner, he stopped laughing immediately. His face rearranged itself so quickly it was almost impressive. "I have to go," he said into the phone, and hung up. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work thing," he said, already opening the refrigerator. "Henderson about the Vancouver shipment." I nodded. I poured myself a glass of water. I didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and we ate dinner with the news on in the background. That night I lay awake listening to him breathe and thought, that wasn't Henderson. I want to be clear about something. I didn't spiral. I didn't go through his phone or cry in the shower or confide in my mother. I'm not built that way. What I did was exactly what I do at work. I started paying attention. Over the next 6 weeks, I noticed things I hadn't let myself notice before. He'd started going to the gym on Sunday mornings, which was new. He'd bought a second phone charger, a USB-C one, even though all his devices used the same standard cable as mine. He'd begun taking longer routes when we drove places together, routes that conveniently passed the west end of the city near Liberty Village. He was careful. He thought he was invisible. He wasn't. Her name was Petra, 29 years old, junior account coordinator at the firm that handled Callum's company's logistics contracts. I found her by cross-referencing his business expense reports. He'd claimed 3 lunches at a restaurant in King West as client development over 6 weeks, all on Wednesdays, all between noon and 2. I searched the restaurant's tagged photos on Instagram by date and time. She appeared in the background of a selfie posted by another diner on all 3 days. She had red hair and a way of leaning toward him that told me everything I needed to know. I felt sick. I want to say I felt cold and calculating, but that would be a lie. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my office building, and I cried until I couldn't anymore. And then I washed my face with a bottle of water from my bag and went back upstairs and finished my workday. I am a practical woman. Grief is something I do on my own time. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I had a feeling I needed to wait, and I've learned to trust that feeling. In late March, Callum told me his company was sending him to a conference in Calgary. 4 days. He said it without looking at me, which he'd started doing more often. And when I asked which hotel he'd be at, he said the Westin, and then immediately went upstairs. I checked the Calgary's conference calendar that evening. Nothing pharmaceutical-related scheduled for those dates. A week before his supposed conference, I came home to find him doing something I'd never seen him do in 9 years of marriage. He was crouched beside my suitcase. the big navy one I used for trips over 3 days. And he had the inner lining panel partially pulled back from the frame. He didn't hear me come in. The door made no sound because I'd replaced the hinges the previous autumn and never got around to telling him. I stood in the hallway for perhaps 4 seconds, watching him, before Bishop came skidding in from the living room and gave me away. Callum stood up very fast. His face went through several expressions before it settled on something resembling calm. "Just checking for that charging cable I thought I left in there," he said. My suitcase had been in the closet for 2 months. He knew exactly what was in it because I kept a packing list taped to the inside lid, a habit from years of work travel. There was no charging cable in there. I said, "Did you find it?" He said, "No." I said, "Okay." And I went and changed out of my work clothes, and I thought about that inner lining panel for the rest of the evening. That night, after he fell asleep, I unzipped my suitcase on the floor of the closet, with the light off, working by the glow of my phone screen. The lining panel on the left interior wall had been repressed down but not properly secured. One corner lifted away from the frame easily. I reached into the gap. The package was about the size of a hardcover novel, wrapped in dark plastic, sealed with tape, dense and slightly yielding. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I had done compliance work adjacent to financial crime long enough to recognize what contraband packaging looks like. I pressed the panel back down, zipped the suitcase, went back to bed, and lay in the dark for a very long time. My husband had planted something in my luggage. My husband, who was taking a business trip to Calgary with his 29-year-old girlfriend, had placed what I was now almost certain were controlled substances inside the hidden lining of my suitcase, presumably so that I would be the one to carry it and be caught with it, while he was conveniently 1,000 kilometers away. I thought about his life insurance comments from the previous year. He'd brought up my policy twice, casually, in the context of making sure we were covered. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. I thought about what being caught with that package at Pearson would mean. Federal drug trafficking charges. My career gone before the cuffs were off. My professional license revoked. My entire life collapsed into a courtroom and a sentencing hearing. And I thought, he actually believes I won't figure this out. That was the moment I stopped being sad and started being something else entirely. I called in sick the next morning and spent 4 hours doing what I do professionally, applied to my own life. I pulled Callum's personal banking through our joint account access, which he'd never thought to restrict, because in his mind I was not someone who looked. I found a second account at a different institution listed on a tax document he'd filed jointly with a numbered company I didn't recognize. I found payments, regular, structured, just under the threshold that triggers automatic reporting flags. $10,000, $9,800, $9,500. Anyone else might have missed the pattern. I have spent 12 years being paid specifically not to miss it. The numbered company was registered in Alberta. Its sole director was a man named Rowan, 53 years old, former operations manager, at a competing firm that had been investigated by Health Canada 3 years prior for distribution irregularities. The investigation had been closed without charges. I noted the name of the RCMP officer who had signed off on the closure. I noted a lot of things. By noon, I had a folder on my encrypted drive that would have made a Crown prosecutor very happy. By 2 o'clock, I had made a decision about the suitcase. Here is what I want to say clearly, because I know how this part sounds. I am not a vigilante. I don't believe in making innocent people suffer for the sins of guilty ones. What I am is someone who looked very carefully at the situation and identified who was actually innocent and who wasn't. Petra was not an innocent bystander. I know people want the cheated-on wife to be purely sympathetic and the affair partner to be purely victimized by the cheating man. And sometimes that's true. This was not that. In the 3 months I'd been paying attention, I had found evidence, in the same expense reports, in email receipts forwarded to our joint address by mistake twice, that Petra was aware the relationship existed, was aware, Kislas and Mary, and had in fact visited our home in Oakville on a Tuesday afternoon in January, when she believed I was in Montreal for work. I had been in Montreal. Bishop, however, had been with the dog walker, who had sent me a photo of him that afternoon taken in our backyard. Petra was visible through the kitchen window in the background. She had been in my house. She had used my kitchen. She had sat at my table and eaten whatever Callum had cooked for her, and she had known exactly who lived there. I want that on record, because what I did next was not something I did to an unknowing person. The suitcase stayed in the closet. I repressed the lining panel exactly as I'd found it. I didn't touch the package. I wore nitrile gloves the one additional time I checked to confirm it was still there, and I replaced everything without leaving any trace. The Sunday before Callum's conference, I watched him finalize his packing and noted that Petra's flight from Toronto to Calgary was booked under her own name on WestJet, departing 2 hours before his Air Canada flight. He'd been careful about that, at least. What he had not been careful about was telling me that Petra would also be staying at the Westin. He hadn't told me. But I knew because I had been paying attention. On the morning of departure, I drove Callum to Pearson myself. He'd asked me to, which I found almost admirable in its audacity. He wanted me to personally deliver the suitcase containing the package to the airport. I parked in the short-term lot. I helped him load his carry-on onto a trolley. I hauled my navy suitcase out of the trunk. "I'm coming in to see you off," I said. "I don't have to be at the office until 11. He could not think of a reason to say no. We checked in at the Air Canada counter together. His bag went through. My suitcase, which he watched with an attention he was trying very hard to disguise as disinterest, was tagged and placed on the belt. Then we went through security together and into the departures terminal, and I suggested coffee while he waited for his gate to be called. We sat at a cafe near the windows, and I watched him watch the departures board, and I thought about 9 years and a dog named Bishop, and the house in Oakville I had helped pay for, and I finished my coffee. I excused myself to use the washroom. The washroom was near a cluster of seating gates. Petra's WestJet flight was boarding from gate F-74. She was sitting in the gate area with a carry-on and a tote bag, scrolling her phone with her red hair pulled back, and she was alone. Her checked bag, a large black Samsonite with a distinctive teal luggage strap, had already been checked at departures. I knew this because I had been in the check-in hall earlier in the morning, before I went to pick up Callum, and I had watched her check in. What I am about to describe took less than 90 seconds. I had retrieved the package from my suitcase the previous evening, after Callum fell asleep, wearing nitrile gloves throughout, and I had replaced the lining panel and resecured it so it looked exactly as it had when he'd originally concealed it. The package had spent the night in a zippered interior pocket of my tote bag, wrapped in a produce bag from the kitchen drawer, handled only with gloves. Petra's tote bag was on the seat beside her, open at the top, while she looked at her phone. I walked past the gate seating. I reached into my tote as I passed. What I deposited took less than 2 seconds. I did not stop walking. I did not look back. I went to the washroom, washed my gloved hands out of habit, removed the gloves and put them in my coat pocket, and returned to the cafe where Callum was drinking his coffee and watching the clock. "Ready?" I said. "Yeah," he said, and stood up and hugged me, and said he'd text me when he landed, and I watched him walk toward his gate. I sat back down with my empty coffee cup. I waited. I was still at the cafe when it happened. 40 minutes later, 2 CBSA officers moved through the departures level with a purpose that made several nearby passengers glance up. They went to the WestJet gates. I heard, from where I was sitting, nothing. The terminal absorbed sound, but I could see the gate area from where I sat if I turned slightly to the right, and I watched Petra stand up, and I watched her tote bag be examined, and I watched her face change. A third officer appeared. Then a fourth. Then I watched Callum, walking back from what I assumed was a stop at a newsstand near his gate, stop dead when he saw the commotion at the WestJet gates. He stood very still. A long moment passed. Then he did something I had not predicted. He walked toward the gates. I have thought about why he did that. My best theory is that he was trying to understand what had gone wrong, whether the package had been found too early, whether there was any way to control the situation. Whatever he was thinking, he walked toward her just as a fifth officer arrived, and the situation became very clearly not one that a bystander should approach. An officer stopped him approximately 6 meters from the gate area and asked him a question. I could not hear what was asked. I watched Callum's face from across the terminal as he answered it. I watched the officer ask a follow-up. I watched Callum answer that too. I watched the officer say something into his radio. They took them both into a secondary area together. I sat at the cafe for another 20 minutes. Then I gathered my things, retrieved my suitcase, which had been cleanly scanned and cleared without incident, from baggage reclaim, and walked out of Terminal 1 into the grey March air of Toronto. Callum called me from a CBSSA holding area at 11:43 that morning. He said there had been an incident and he wasn't going to make his flight. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, something thin and precarious, like ice you weren't sure would hold. I said, "What kind of incident?" He said there had been a customs issue. I said, "Callum, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" There was a long pause. "Vivienne," he said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." I listened. What he said over the next 3 minutes was, from an evidentiary standpoint, extraordinary. He was frightened, and he was trying to explain himself without explaining himself. And he made several statements that established, without any ambiguity, that he had known about the package, that he had intended it to be in my luggage, and that he had not expected it to end up anywhere near Petra. I did not have the call recorded, because I am not in law enforcement, and that's not how any of this works. What I did have was a very clear memory and 9 years of experience constructing documentary evidence trails. I hung up and immediately wrote down every word I could recall, timestamped, and emailed it to myself and to my personal lawyer, who was a woman named Audrey and who I had retained 4 days prior. Audrey had also received, the previous Thursday, a complete copy of the financial documentation I had compiled regarding the numbered company, the structured payments, and Rowan. She had already forwarded it to the appropriate division of the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. She had done so because I had asked her to, and because the documentation was thorough enough that she agreed it warranted attention. 2 things happened over the following 6 weeks. The first was that CBSA and the RCMP jointly investigated the origin of the package found in Petra's possession. Callum's name came up. Several things Callum had said during his detention, things he had said, on record, to federal officers while frightened and improvising, proved difficult to walk back. The second was that the financial crimes investigation made progress of its own, independently, the way these things do when the paperwork is clean and the trail is clear. My divorce lawyer, not Audrey, a different woman, because Audrey did financial law, and I believe in using the right specialist for each task, told me I had one of the more straightforward asset cases she'd seen in a while, given the documentation I provided. The house in Oakville was in both our names. The investment accounts were joint. The financial misconduct, once established, affected the distribution considerably in my favor. Bishop stayed with me. That was the part I cared about most, and I'm aware that says something about me, and I'm comfortable with it. Callum's situation resolved the way these things do when you've made statements to federal officers, and there's paper behind you and in front of you, and you have no particularly clean exit. He accepted a plea arrangement. The terms are not something I'm going to discuss, because they're part of a legal proceeding, and also so because they're not really the point. The point is that on a Tuesday morning in early October, 7 months after I stood in the departures terminal at Pearson and watched everything I'd planned come together in 90 seconds, I was sitting on the back porch in Oakville with a mug of coffee and Bishop's head on my knee, and the autumn light was coming through the maple at the back of the yard. And he thought I would just carry it. He thought I would walk through that airport with his package in my suitcase, not knowing, not looking, not paying attention. He had looked at 9 years of marriage to me and concluded that I was someone who didn't notice things. I notice everything. I always have. It's how I'm built. It's the thing about me he never once took the time to understand. He made his plan around the woman he assumed I was. I made mine around the woman I actually am. The maple had gone almost entirely orange by then, the way they do in Ontario in October, that particular shade of rust and fire that people come from all over to see. Bishop snored softly under my hand. The coffee was good. The morning was quiet in the way mornings only are when there's nothing you're waiting for anymore, nothing unresolved, no sound coming from anywhere that you have to brace yourself to hear. I sat there for a long time. I was in no hurry at all.